Steven, do you know how much of your brain you use on a daily basis?
I do now after today's episode.
We interviewed Dr. Ginger Campbell, host of Brain Science, which is a podcast and so much more. You can find her on YouTube and other audio podcasts. She talked to us today about all things brain.
Yeah, she has a very popular podcast. Please check it out. And after you watch this episode, she gave us her extended list of things about the brain. And so she gave us a bonus list because we had a little more time. And we talked about that. And then Sarah and I threw some questions at her to answer, which I don't think she even had to think to answer our questions. That might have been a little too easy maybe, but it was really cool talking about how much of the brain you use, left brain, right brain, discussing that and changes in the brain. It was a lot of fun. We learned a lot. And so make sure you stay to the end so you hear some of those questions and get some of those answers for yourself too. And we hope you enjoy this one. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome to Superheroes of Science. I'm Steven.
And I'm Sarah. We co-host Science from the Experts. Our guests are professionals doing cutting-edge science right now.
They're experts in their field discussing what they know best. So listen up and learn real science from real people.
Subscribe now and stay informed of our latest episodes and show your support.
Well, joining us today on Superheroes of Science, we're so excited to welcome Dr. Ginger Campbell, host of the Brain Science podcast. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, we certainly appreciate you taking time. And we know you're a busy person, and it seems like you have a lot of irons in the fire from what I saw and read on you. And you were recommended to us because it's obviously about science, and podcasts are definitely second nature for you at this point.
Yeah, I'm heading to, actually, I guess last week was the 15th anniversary of Brain Science. It started out as the Brain Science podcast. I took podcast out of the name about, over 5 years ago, because I thought podcasts had become redundant.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, congratulations. That's quite a milestone and that's got to be exciting.
Say for 15 years running strong still. That's very impressive. No wonder it rated so high.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does have a few iTunes, track records helping it.
Great. Well, so brain science. So we want to know more. So where do we begin? Like where's a good starting point to begin with brain science?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is, the tagline for my show is the show for everyone who has a brain. And that is supposed to capture the idea that this show is intended for regular people. It's not aimed at scientists, although about 20% of the audience is MDs or PhDs. That was not, my intention. And you'd be surprised how many times I have a t-shirt that says that on it, and I'll get people saying, I can't listen to your show because I don't have a brain. They think that's really funny, but I really don't think it's very funny. So that's the first thing I'd like to say is that no matter what your background, the show can be for you. I've heard from people who haven't been to college, plumbers, tattoo artists, house painters, everything from that to, the guys that are in the trenches doing the work who enjoy listening so they can find out what other people are up to.
Absolutely.
That's what we run too. Ours is really for everyone and anyone interested in science at all. We do get feedback from professionals, and the scientists know that sometimes their peers are listening in, which is sometimes it's pressure for them, and sometimes they're just like, "This is what it is."
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it does keep you careful about what you say and do. That's a good thing.
Yes,
definitely. Yeah. So I see when we talk about the brain, do we start from like a physiological side, like a chemical biology side, or is it do we talk just as much about the psychology of the brain?
Well, I'm kind of a big picture person. I have done episodes about the biology and the chemistry and neurotransmitters, and I do those from time to time. But I try to focus really on, why does this matter to you as a regular person? And that's really the level of focus I have. So some of my listeners will write to me and say that they think that neuroscience is going to replace psychology. I think that that's not true, because psychology is the field that is devoted to the whole person approach, or should be, right? And just looking at just the brain is not enough. A good example is drug addiction. If you say, oh, drug addiction is a brain disease, which is the current model that is very popular because that's how you get money, it ignores the role of the environment and the fact that, the best treatment programs for drug addiction have to take into account environment, otherwise they fail. So I don't think psychology is going to be replaced by neuroscience. I think good psychology requires a basis in neuroscience.
That's very well said. And that makes sense. It's that environmental factors are something oftentimes we overlook, I think. It's easy to, especially for us, because we're just all about the science. And so it's easy to get wrapped up in science and forget about the external variables, such as environment, when you're looking at things like this.
Definitely.
And so definitely. You had, I know that when we were talking about the neuroscience side of things, you were talking about the 5 big things, I think, if I remember right. And so would you care to kind of go over and explain some of those for us?
Sure. And I'll just give a plug that if somebody wants the handout for this, all you have to do is text brain science, all one word, to 55444. And you'll automatically get my newsletter and this handout. And then you can always unsubscribe if you don't want to hear about episodes of the show. But I just want to say that that's an easy way to get the handout for these 5 things. The first one is really kind of obvious, but important, which is that the brain creates everything that we experience. And, that may seem obvious, but it really hasn't been that long since, you remember, Aristotle thought all the brain did was cool the blood, right? And the ancient Egyptians used to throw away the brain when they made their mummies. So it's not like we've always appreciated how important the brain is. And, many traditions still work on the assumption that somehow consciousness is separate from the brain. But at this point, the evidence that our experience is totally dependent on our brain is it's as solid as any other kind of science fact you could think of. So that's important because obviously it has a lot of implications. One of the most practical one is it means that none of us has a full access to what's going on. What we know is basically what our brain tells us. And each one of us has a unique experience. It's not just because of our past, but in our particular sensory world. My experience of the world is not the same as my golden retriever's, obviously. He loves nasty smells. But I think this should be a step toward having some more tolerance toward one another, understanding that, there is no way any person has an objective view of reality. Now, science, the goal of science is to come up with evidence that we can all have access to, and if we're good scientists, reproduce. Any questions on that one before I go to number 2? Now I have to think if I can remember what number 2 is. Oh, yeah, because I did not put my list in front of me. Second one is that most of what our brain does is unconscious. And that's a big theme of my book, The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. In terms of the evidence for this is something that is even, you might say, somewhat newer. I mean, for a long time, neuroscientists actually thought that perception, which you might think, well, perception, that's an obvious example of an unconscious process of the brain, right? We know that now, but that's actually relatively new. In fact, von Helmholtz, who was the first person who proposed that perception might be unconscious, was kind of ignored because at the time, scientists assumed perception was fully conscious. Interestingly, I'm blanking on the guy's name. Oh yeah, Stanislas Dehaene, who is one of the leading researchers on consciousness. He's French. He did a lot of research, really basically demonstrating how much, even though he's a consciousness researcher, part of that has to do with showing how much was really going on unconsciously. And the reason I focused on certainty in my book, I was sort of piggybacking on the work of Robert Burton, who I highly recommend as a guest, is that, when we believe something, we're sure about it, we then can obviously justify that. But actually what we believe is not under our conscious control. And I actually think that this is important for science people to understand when they're going, oh, you're stupid because you believe in God. Because actually, when it gets right down to it, we can be looking at the same set of facts and get different conclusions. Even in science, we see that. You know how you see one person's correlation is another person's proof, right? Because the way we weigh things. So again, calling somebody stupid because they've reached a different set of conclusions, it doesn't accomplish anything. It just turns, I think you can be a scientific fundamentalist, if you know what I mean, be just as intolerant as, those that are clinging to beliefs that are totally unscientific. So that's why I think understanding how much that we do that's unconscious is really important in terms of being able to deal with each other.
Can I ask, so the whole part, well, sorry, Stephen, I jumped in before you, but the perception being unconscious, are we, and I don't have the words, so I'll try to frame the question as best I can, but when we talk about this unconscious, is it things like our body systems? I feel like maybe I'm still thinking too,
right?
It's like this, or is it unconscious just thought in general about what we're perceiving and maybe stimuli that we're experiencing, or both?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think I didn't do a very good job of introducing that idea. So let's take perception as a simple example. We know that when light hits the retina, it starts getting processed even at the level of the retina. So by the time we experience a visual scene, it has no relationship to what hit our retina. Okay, so that's perception. That's an example of something that's almost but even that, that's almost entirely unconscious, yet our conscious experience affects it. There's top-down feedback. We tend to see what we expect to see. By looking for different things, we have conscious control over what we're looking for, right? So if you are looking for a certain thing, it may or may not pop out at you, right, when you look for it. Sometimes it's like the thing you're looking for, you just look right through it. So that's kind of a straightforward one. Then it gets more complicated because, like, say you're learning how to ride a bike, right? When you're learning how to ride a bike or drive a car, you have to think about everything, right? But eventually, most of that becomes unconscious. It becomes automatic. And so that's more a hybrid because you can still sort of access some of it. The key thing is that that most of the stuff that is unconscious is not accessible. And that's important because it means that introspection is not a reliable guide to what's really going on. Unfortunately, we'd like to think there's this long tradition of thinking that if we could just look deeper into ourselves, we would understand ourselves better. But because of this unconscious element, and I'm not talking about Freud's pseudo-scientific unconscious, I'm talking about the real unconscious processes of the brain. So there's, like I said, there's the things that are just totally unconscious, but then think about it. Some people can start to control things that we think of as unconscious, like slow their heart rate down, right? So even the stuff that we think of as being totally unconscious sometimes, gets along the edges. So it reminds us of the danger of black and white thinking, right? Lots of times either or gets us in trouble. Sometimes it's both.
And so there are some processes that the brain's going through that we're not controlling. It's just happening. But there are times that we can consciously make an effort to alter those things.
Right. But go back to vision. You can't unsee a visual illusion, right? Have you ever looked at those pictures in the books? Even when you know that they're an illusion, you still see them, right? So that is an example of something that really is totally unconscious. Even knowing what you're really looking at, you can't affect it. Those things that flip back and forth between like the vase and the faces, it's going to do that. You can't control it. Okay, so that's an example of something that's really more on the pure unconscious processing end. And then something that you have learned how to do consciously is more on the, you can consciously control it, but don't have to end. And then there's a lot of stuff in the middle. But the thing is, there really is a lot of stuff going on in the unconscious that we don't have access to. And so to claim, and it's really, for example, moral reasoning, there's lots of evidence that people come up with their position like this, and then they make up a story for why their position is right. Okay. So that's what I meant by the fact that the introspection has its limits. But I really think it's more important to think of the fact that, you need to reach conclusions. You're always working on incomplete information. And if you didn't reach conclusions that felt very confident and sure, you would be frozen or eaten by the tiger if you like. So you can see the evolutionary reason why we have this sense of, yeah, I know it, even when we might be wrong, because it keeps us able to function. Do you want me to go to number 3 now?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So the next one is everyone's memory is unreliable. Everyone's memory is unreliable. And the reason for this is that memory doesn't work it doesn't work like a video recorder. We don't make an exact recording of what happens and then play it back. Instead, what we now know is that every time we remember something, we basically recreate the experience. It uses the parts of our brain that were originally involved. The problem is, as a part of that recreation, we also add things that have happened or we have learned since that event occurred. So, for example, I was a little kid when President Kennedy was assassinated, and I have this strong memory of spending 3 days in front of the TV set. And during that time, Lee Harvey Oswald was assassinated on live TV. Okay, I think that I saw that, but I might not have, because I also saw replays of it, and it became a part of my memory of the event. So whether I actually saw it when it really happened, I don't know. There's a famous experiment that was done at the time of the Challenger disaster. Are you familiar with this story? It's the one about the flashbulb memories. Flashbulb memories is the idea that when something has a lot of emotional content, it's more accurately remembered. Actually false, but anyway, that's the idea. So what they did was they talked to, of course, it's a psychology experiment, so they talked to college students right after the Challenger disaster and had them write down, what they were doing, what they were feeling, etc. Then a couple of years later, they re-interviewed them, and only 25% of them gave stories that matched what they had originally written. Not only that, there was actually one guy who, looking at his own handwriting, said, I know that's what I wrote, but what I remember is what really happened. He actually rejected his own contemporaneous account in favor of his reconstructed memory. And Elizabeth Loftus is the person who's done the most work in she's the one who debunked the whole repressed memory stuff that people were doing back in the 90s, because she showed how easy it is to install false memories in people. And if you ever get a chance to hear her talk, it's pretty amazing. The last time I heard her talk, she did this thing where she showed us these pictures, like a lineup of guys, and said, which one? And she got us all to remember the wrong guy by the end. I mean, which is why eyewitness testimony is really not reliable. This is another one that has a lot of practical significance, because, like, say somebody's story of an event changes, and then someone's saying, oh, they have dementia, or oh, they're lying. Well, neither one of those has to be true. Stories naturally evolve as we tell them, not because we intend for them to, but because stuff gets added in. I kind of figure all these people who think they remember being a baby, which is physiologically impossible, that what they've really done is incorporated the memories from their family that they were told growing up about what happened when they were a baby. And unfortunately, your sense of how accurate a memory is not reliable. So if you're arguing with somebody, do either one of you have brothers and sisters?
We both do.
Yeah. Have you talked to them about something that happened when you were kids and discovered you have entirely different memories of that event? It's like you didn't even have the same childhood sometimes. So that's a good example of how that happens. I find it fascinating I have a sister who's only a year younger than me, and we have some amazingly different memories of major events, actually. So it's kind of interesting. So think of the feuds that people get into over what happened back when. Maybe you're both wrong. So that's the reason why I consider that one to be very important. Number 4 is that you're wired to be social. Again, this is one of those ones that might seem obvious, especially after this last almost 2 years of the pandemic, where you've seen how horrible it is to be isolated from one another. But there's a whole branch of neuroscience called social neuroscience, which is really, fascinating, because there's even theories that the reason why our brain got so big was so that we would be able to get along with each other or not. This one is just, really important, because one of the things that makes it important is that it gives us some insight into why, living in a culturally diverse society is such a challenge. I mean, we are naturally drawn to people that look like us. That's not something another one of those things we don't have conscious control over. And you can imagine why. I mean, in the early days of humans, we would have needed to know who's our friends and who's our foe pretty quick, right? And so we have, an unconscious bias, right, for the people who are like us. But that's not the same thing as prejudice. And I think it's really important not to labels, like when you take one of those implicit bias tests and then say, oh, you're prejudiced because you have an implicit bias against so-and-so. No, they aren't the same thing. You can't control your unconscious bias, but you can be aware of it and try to consciously make decisions. So that's one reason why I think it's really important to understand this role of our social brain. And my 5th one is, you are not a brain in a vat. Now, your audience is probably aware of this image of the brain in the vat, but I always think of, back in the 80s, there was this movie called All of Me. Have either one of you seen it? It has Steve Martin and Lily Tomlin. And Lily Tomlin she's a head in a jar, like on Futurama. You've seen Futurama? Okay, but the basic idea is it gets back to that idea that your consciousness could be separate from your body. And that's just not how it works. The more we learn, the more we've come to appreciate how important embodiment is. Your brain relies on your body for everything it knows about the world, right? And everything that it does in the world, it relies on your body. And this is where the gap between, one of the gaps between artificial intelligence and, embodied in consciousness comes in, because intelligence and consciousness are not the same thing. Google's search engine might be really intelligent at what it does, but it's not going to become conscious just because it can put all these facts together, because it's not embodied. So I think that one bottom line is, don't be putting all your eggs in the hay. I'll just upload my consciousness and not worry about what's going to happen to the earth, because no, as human beings, we are embodied consciousnesses, and we need, our brain is part of our body for one thing, but we need the whole package. This one would have usually been in the top 5, but I've been doing my show so long, I no longer consider it in the top 5. But that is the fact that your brain is plastic and continues to change throughout your life. When I first started my podcast, that was a new idea, but it's not really a new idea anymore. In fact, now it's to this point of just being exploited by charlatans who want to, sell you various miracle things to make your brain better, brain exercises and whatnot. But it is important to know that your brain is constantly changing. And no matter how old you are, you can learn new things. In fact, the most important thing you can do to keep your brain healthy is to continue to challenge it to learn new things.
Now, I have a question about number 4 about being wired to be social.
Okay.
That would seem more like psychology than neuroscience. That surprised me when I read that, because you gave me a handout ahead of time. But that really surprised me to see that as a neuroscience thing, because I just thought a social thing was just something that we just kind of emotionally needed, and I didn't think about it ever being part of the brain.
Okay, so one thing I left out because I was, going off the cuff without notes is that. For example, we know, this is a neuroscience thing, we know that when someone is socially rejected, it stimulates some of the same parts of the brain that stimulate physical pain. So it hurts to be rejected. It hurts, right? And that's a brain. And where do you experience pain? In your brain, right? So there is a neuroscience element to it. But I guess I would classify that one as the reason why I say that my show is a big picture show and not just a brain show. The reason the show is called Brain Science is because when I started out, iTunes was just starting to do podcasts. They still had this website called the Podcast Pickle, which was the leading place you went to find podcasts, believe it or not. And I thought, hey, brain, A, B, C, like the old fashioned Yellow Pages way of choosing your name. So that's why brain is in the name of my show, although I do think it's less intimidating than the word neuroscience. So I'm glad you pointed out social sounds like something psychology. That's not a bad thing, because like I said, I think, there's an awful lot of psychologists these days calling themselves neuroscientists because they think it sounds cooler, even though they're really psychologists.
We as in humanity or scientists there, not me, have mapped out the brain where we do really understand. I hear people saying, "Oh, that's the left, right," and Sarah, even you said earlier this week, "Oh, that crosses the left and right barrier." And
it crosses.
Is that legit? Is that real, or is that just something that we tend to say?
Well, it's like Brenda Milner, who, she probably is almost 100 now, but she did some of the famous experiments with HM, the guy that had his hippocampus destroyed. I had her on long ago, and she said, you use both sides of your brain for everything. The thing is, the split brain experiments are not representative of what our brain does in real life. It is true that there's what's called lateralization, which begins in primates, and I'm not sure whether there's any other mammals that have lateralization, but I know it's a primate feature, which is that one side of the brain is doing more of one thing than another. The most obvious one is we think of it as the left brain as being usually where language is, but that doesn't mean that it's doing it all on its own. Okay, I think the whole left brain, right brain thing, to be honest, is totally blown out of proportion. We're coming to appreciate that it's not as much about, this part of the brain does this and this part of the brain does that, as it is who talks to who. Right. So that's the idea of networking and the connectome. Have you heard of the connectome? So there's researchers doing this whole human connectome project where they want to get all the wiring of the brain. The problem is we only have the wiring for one brain, and that's the C. elegans roundworm that has only 302 neurons. And even with that wiring diagram, we can't predict what that little worm is going to do. And the wiring diagram is going to be constantly changing. Back to plasticity. I mean, even if we had the technology to figure out the wiring diagram, we would be having a snapshot. This is the wiring diagram right now, or right when the pictures were made. So I think that, but the key idea is that different parts of the brain have to talk to each other to actually get things done, rather one part of the brain being like, I'm the guy who does this and you do that. That's the modular model, which is still really popular, especially with some philosophers. But, I actually would go so far as to say that I think where is the wrong question. If you ask, where in the brain does X, it's really the wrong question. But the problem is with, functional MRI being so popular, it's like that old saying about, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. For example, MRI is really easy to study certain parts of the brain and not so easy to study others. And so then what's going to happen is the parts you can study are going to be studied in preference. And so we get this skewed. I mean, here's another example. What does the MRI do? Doesn't actually measure brain activity, right? It only measures blood flow. So it tells you that a certain area is active. It doesn't exactly tell you what it's doing. In fact, if you get really good at something, the part of your brain that does it doesn't actually need much blood to do that thing, right? So where's the inferences, this is lighting up more, therefore this is where it's doing it, is a little shaky. It may be true, it may not be true, but so that's why I'm not a big fan of the where question. I think how, why are more interesting questions. And again, getting back to the big picture. We do, of course, know that certain parts of the brain are essential. They're lost, and then we can't do a particular thing. But again, it doesn't necessarily tell us what that part's role is. That part's role might be that it's the place that connects the other guys together, right? So it's a lot more complicated than, your left brain, your right brain is what makes you artistic. That's just total. Put it out of your mind and your brain.
And on that, I guess on that strand, would it be the same? I'm guessing no, that it wouldn't be the same for everybody, that there might be regions that either work together, or like you're saying, that's not even necessarily the right question to ask where, but.
Right. Well, that's a really good point, because if you do MRIs on multiple people, you see overlap, but nobody's exactly the same. So that is a good point. Now, we do know, most of what we know about what parts of the brain are really essential for certain things come from patients who have deficits. For example, we know that the hippocampus is essential for making new memories because when we destroy people's hippocampus to try to fix their seizures. They couldn't make any new memories. So that was an oops back in the 50s. But yeah, so we know that, and of course, way back in, even I guess it was in the 1800s that the first parts of the brain that were associated with speech were identified. So, we know that there are certain areas that have, are in common between people. But then we also know that people, because of plasticity, can learn to use parts of their brain differently. For example, if a person's blind, their visual cortex doesn't sit there doing nothing. It takes up other things. It does hearing, it does touch. If you look at the neurons in the cortex, they are not different back here compared to here. They're all pretty similar. So that's where it's who you're talking to that really matters, seems to come in.
So
like a flood. Oh, go ahead, Stephen.
No, go ahead. You're fine.
I was just saying, I'm getting like a flood of questions now that I'm.
Go ahead. One at a time, though.
Yeah, right. Well, so one, I know I've heard it all my life, and I've just never listened. I've never thought of it. But you hear people say like, well, you only use.
I knew that was coming as soon as you said. Yes, you only use 10% of your brain. False. But I never get over how many times I see magazines on the newsstand by reputable things like National Geographic that are still, saying that. It's like the bad idea that won't. Here's a good scientific question. Why are bad ideas harder to get rid of than the truth? I'd like to know the answer to that. But anyway, no. I mean, you use all of your brain. I mean, the funny thing about it is that it turns out that a lot of the time your brain does its own thing. It turns out that spontaneous activity is a big part of what the brain does. You might have heard of the default mode network. That's becoming a hot idea. That's the part that appears to be active when you're sitting there doing nothing. But your brain's never sitting there doing nothing, right? Even when you're asleep. And even if you're not dreaming, your brain's doing stuff. So yeah, throw out that 10%. Yeah. And there's not an exercise that you can do to make yourself use more of your brain. That's, yeah. And you can't learn in your sleep because it turns out that attention is essential to making new memories. So you can't learn stuff you're not paying attention to.
Well, related to that, okay, I have one more question. And I promise I'll let you take a turn. But so I agree. I know I've actually tried that, been desperate before. And I have a big test. I'm just going to sleep on my book. Maybe this will. But this happened. I was really struggling with a math problem in college, and I couldn't get it. I didn't know. I went to bed and I dreamed the answer, and I woke up and I knew how to answer it. I answered it correctly. And so I feel like people, my friends were like, whatever, you didn't.
Yeah. And that is, that's great. That's great. In Robert Burton, who is the person I got most of my ideas about the unconscious origins of certainty from, he uses that example all the time of, you can't think of the solution to a problem and you sleep on it and you wake up and you know the answer. And it's because your brain has continued to work on the problem. Right. And then it feels like it's popped out of nowhere because we're not aware of the processes. I mean, when you're trying to solve a problem consciously, you have a different sense of effort than you have when it seems like it came out of nowhere. But in reality, it's coming out of the same place. I mean, it's coming from your brain. And it's really kind of interesting because people, depending on what their beliefs are, their interpretation of these coming out of nowhere like experiences are going to be very different. It can range to, my muse, God told me, just about any, worldview you want can be used as an explanation for why the answer popped up. And the dreaming part, I mean, that just seemed, there's actually good evidence that dreaming, one of the roles of dreaming is consolidating of new ideas. So it's probably not as surprising as it might seem that we might occasionally dream solutions. The famous example of the guy who supposedly dreamed the hexane ring, the organic chemistry thing.
Yes.
So yeah, so just put yourself in that category. Good on you.
Interesting.
Do your neurons themselves change? I mean, we talk about the brain being pliable and how it will change, but it's like, is that actual where everything is in the brain? Does that change too?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on that at all, but I do know that there's a lot of evidence that that the dendrites change, which are the branches that receive information. They have these little knobby places where they make more connections. And there's a lot of evidence that they can get more knobby, which means that they can make more connections. So there's a lot of people doing work on the real, you might say guts of what's going on. But yes, it really is at the level of the brain synapses, which is the connections between neurons. Exactly what's going on inside neurons, I don't know if anybody's really studying that yet. I mean, there's a lot of stuff we still don't know. I mean, despite the fact that we've learned an awful lot in the last 50 years, the Society for Neuroscience just celebrated its 50th anniversary with their meeting last month. But, the amount we know is teeny compared to the stuff we still don't know.
Okay.
I mean, neuroscience is a very young science if you compare it to, say, physics.
Mm-hmm. I can see it being a very hard thing to study and collect data on.
Well, the tricky thing about neuroscience is you have to rely on what they call convergent data, because what that means is there's things you can study in people, like MRIs and stuff, and then there's things like what's happening down in the neuron. You can't do that in a person, right? So they still have a need for animal experiments. They do a lot with mice because as being that there's a lot in common in all mammal brains. That's why they can use mice. And they get information from these different levels, and then there's the tricky part of asking, can this really be extrapolated from between species? Then what they have to do is they do the experiments in different species. And if they keep getting the same thing, then they think, well, this is probably something that all the species have in common. But there's certain things you cannot, for example, single neuron recordings are very rarely done in people because you don't want electrodes in your brain. So the only time that they're done is when someone is going to have a neurosurgical procedure and they're doing recording before the operation. They do this so that they won't destroy important parts when they do their procedures. So that's when they get the single cell recordings. The famous Jennifer Aniston neuron experiment was done in that context. So that's one of the things that adds to the challenge, is that you can't do it all take MRIs. They're so super, super popular. They're super, super slow relative to how fast brains work. So, you can't do timing experiments with a MRI. So it's very challenging but exciting field, because I don't really care about quantum mechanics. It doesn't have much impact on my day-to-day life, but understanding how my brain works can help me understand, why I do things I do and why other people do things they do. And I think it's critical now that we really have a better understanding of each other if we're going to move forward without, bad results.
Yeah.
So as people, it seems like sometimes some people just think like they just think so much more quickly than I can. And then sometimes I feel like I can think more quickly than some other people with different things. Is that a neuron thing? Is that a synapses firing, or is it a chemical thing? What controls the speed of thought? Wow, that's like this seems like such a big question all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's complicated. For example, we do know that as we get older, and I'm in the older group now, so I experience this. We do know that processing speeds go down as a natural part of aging. And that does not mean, you don't have to have anything wrong with you. It just is what it is. And one of the things that's interesting about it is it appears that that one of the things that happens is that the signals get noisier. So for anyone out there who's in engineering, especially electrical engineering, understands signal to noise ratio ideas, that's part of it. It seems like the signals are getting noisier. And, if you look at something like autism, it may turn out to be that too much noise is a big part of what's going on in autism. I mean, people with autism tend to be hypersensitive to things like touch. They clothes drive them crazy. It's like they're getting too much signal. So that's just one tiny element of it that I do know about is the noisiness part. And that affects not only the processing speed, but the accuracy. So take, for example, the fact that most people as they get older have trouble understanding what they hear in a noisy environment. That doesn't necessarily mean they have a hearing deficit. Okay. So I'm sorry I can't give more detail because it's not a field I know a lot about, and I would say that's probably one of the ones where we're really at a very primitive stage.
No, it's that. Okay, that makes a little bit more.
But one thing I would say is you're right. Processing speed is important to intelligence. In fact, one of the things that gets smart people in trouble is processing speed, because we have this natural tendency to assume that when we think of something fast, that it's right. And that's, we have the sense that that's the right answer when it comes to us quickly. And so people who are really fast processors they'll come up with an answer and they'll be more likely to be sure they're right, though they aren't necessarily right. Okay, so that's a hazard of being smart and having fast processing speed.
Cool.
This has been fascinating. I really appreciate, we really appreciate that that you're able to speak to us today about these things.
Well, I've enjoyed it a lot. I hope that maybe a few people might check out the show. Is it okay if I give them that information again?
Absolutely. Yes.
And we'll also put
okay.
descriptions.
Yeah. So obviously you can just get Brain Science in any audio app, and my website's brainsciencepodcast.com. That's really tricky. But if you'd like a handout about these 5 things, you can sign up for my newsletter. Just text the word Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. That's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444.
Now I'm going to remember that number all day. It's going to be stuck because as you were saying it, I was repeating it in my head.
Yeah, you guys, if you have a newsletter, you should get one of those. It's really, I've been getting lots of people signing up that way. It seems really popular.
So this is the first time I've seen that. I mean, I've seen like stores text this number and stuff. I've never thought for a newsletter or something. That's really cool.
Yeah, well, I can tell you how to sign up for it.
I like that.
I do too. I like this. Is that maybe what we've been brainstorming call to action items. So maybe this seems like a very doable, something simple they can do. And
yeah, I think it works. I mean, I'm not keeping track of whether people sign up on the website, but I get a notice every time somebody does it on the text thing. So I know it's working.
Yeah.
That's a really good idea. How often do you put out a newsletter thing for like each episode or just every once?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I will do extra newsletters, but I have my website set up so that when my show notes go out, it automatically generates a newsletter.
Oh,
So that's,
okay.
that's, you need to automate as many things as you can.
yes.
Yeah, because we don't do a lot of these things because I didn't realize you could automate it. And I know we don't have time to do it.
Yeah.
So, well, awesome. Thank you again for taking time to talk with us. This has been really, really good. This was fun.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Science from the Experts from Purdue University Superheroes of Science.
If you like this episode, subscribe, give us a positive review, and share the love. Boiler up!
Hammer down.